I'll call to order the City Finance Committee meeting for July 19th. We only have one item on the agenda, which is the Facilities Maintenance Budget and Financial Modeling Overview. Mr. Dewey, I assume that's your item, so please go right ahead.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and I'm Jim Dewey, the Facilities and Energy Manager. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about our facilities budget and a little bit about our facilities resource renewal model. And this was really a discussion that was brought about after we had our budget session with Council for Public Works. So there were a lot of questions about facilities and capital maintenance funding and in particular the facilities resource renewal model, and that's what we use to model all of our capital maintenance needs. So I'm going to be talking about both of those things today. Okay, the first part of my presentation is I'm going to discuss where our revenue comes from, what we do with our revenue. I'll be discussing the Facilities Resource Renewal Model, or FRRM, and I'll talk a little bit about some facilities budget challenges. So facilities gets its revenue from really three sources: allocated charges from other city departments, chargebacks for work requests from general fund and enterprise fund programs for special projects. These are just on-demand type of services that we provide like a contractor would. And then we also receive grants, incentives, and oftentimes one-time CIP funding that's usually approved by council for specific projects. And we have a number of programs in the facilities division. That includes building maintenance, the annex yard operations, and some of those other programs listed. But I'm going to be focusing on primarily, this slide right here comes from our budget presentation from May.
Could I interrupt for a quick question?
Right ahead.
Yes.
So the chargeback versus allocated charges, so the original source of the revenue is the same, but they're accounted for differently?
Well, they're not allocated charges. They're charged, basically a department may come to us and say, hey, like El Estero wastewater treatment plant may come and want welding and fabrication services done, and we'll quote a price to them, and then we'll receive revenue directly from them. But it's not an allocated charge. It's really money that comes to us, and we have an appropriation for it, but we may or may not even receive all of those funds in a given year. It depends on the demand for our services. So that's basically contracting services.
So that would be more of a specialized ad hoc thing, not like regular maintenance of lighting.
Correct. It would not be regular maintenance. It wouldn't be responding to service calls. It wouldn't be capital maintenance. These are like special capital projects that are usually generated from enterprise funds, and we take care of those as a service to the city.
Councilmember White?
Just get an example of that.
Anytime, like at Public Works, if they want to remodel an area of like the engineering area, that would be outside of the area of capital maintenance. That would be a capital improvement that would be driven by Public Works, and so we would quote a price for that, provide furniture, provide all the electrical and communication hookups, and would provide that whole service. If El Estero wastewater treatment plant needed some fabrication done to install a pump equipment or something like that, that would be done on this basis too. So we'd have welders and fabricators and plumbers come in and provide a service at a given price.
Are the chargebacks then generally extra budgetary? They weren't in the previous budget. They came up between when the budget was passed and when they ask you for the work?
No, they are. We put in a holding number. It's about $860,000 that we appropriate for that revenue. Whether or not we bring in that much revenue or whether we bring in more than that revenue, we don't know. It really depends on the demand for services during the year. But I'll show that more clearly.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So we're going to be looking at the building maintenance budget, which is really the most complex budget that we have and where a lot of your questions come from. This is how we fund our capital maintenance in facilities, is through the building maintenance budget. So these are our revenues. This year, we have base revenues set at $3,639,000. And they come from basically 4 different places, and I'll talk about each one of those. The first is allocated charges for planned maintenance, and that's $1,143,000. And what this is, it's to fund our capital maintenance program. And what capital maintenance really means to us is that we are replacing and renewing building systems within buildings. And I'm going to talk about the nuances of that a little bit later about capital maintenance versus major renewal. But in a building, we have a number of building systems, roofing systems, plumbing, doors and windows, flooring. Each one of those systems has a certain life associated with it, and we're responsible for replacing those systems in order to keep that building functional. So this is all funded through interdepartment reimbursements or allocated charges. The second item is allocated charges for service calls. This is about $1.5 million, and what this covers is our reactive response to any service call that anyone may call in from any department. Calls for heating and cooling, plumbing leaks, roof leaks, electrical problems, and so on. It also includes a component for routine maintenance, which includes things like periodic maintenance for air conditioning, elevators, roll-up doors, backflow preventers, things that need to be maintained on a regular basis. The third area is the area that Councilmember Dominguez was referring to, building maintenance work orders for chargeback work. We have $860,000 appropriated for that work. Okay, when we start off the beginning of the year, we don't have that money coming into us. We don't really know exactly where that money is going to come from, but it really is dependent on demand for our construction services. And we get demand from both enterprise funds, primarily enterprise funds, but also general fund programs. And so this includes remodels, furniture purchases and installations, special requests for painting, welding and fabrication services, and so on.
So you just estimate this number at the beginning of the year based on historical use, and that trues up one way or the other depending on what the utilization of those services are at the end of the year.
Correct. It's just based on historic information. And then the last area is just other sources. Sometimes we get one-time general fund appropriations for CIP projects, capital improvement projects. We get energy incentive funds that are sometimes invested into new lighting systems in our buildings, and we get grant funding. Like last year, we got a grant for $1.2 million for the permeable paver system that we put in over in the Laguna complex. So this number right here varies too. It really, if we come in with a major grant, of course, we're going to come back to council and appropriate those funds. But this is base budget. Okay, so that's where our revenues come from. Now, looking at it from the expenditure side, the first area, this is just looking at building maintenance. Our routine maintenance is about $150,000, and routine maintenance are those things, air conditioning, maintaining the elevator systems, things that all the routine maintenance items that I just spoke about. We have maintenance materials of $300,000. These are the materials in contract that our staff use in order to support our service call programs. So when someone calls in for a plumbing leak or something needs to be, a hot water heater needs to be changed, that will come from this pot of money. The next item is other building maintenance expenses. This is basically our overhead. We pay allocated charges like everyone else. We pay the city's overhead like everyone else. We have a lot of administrative expense. That's what this is. So it's a little over $700,000. And then we have the facilities capital program. So this is really a independent program that funds our major capital projects. And this year, we have about $500,000 in that program. And I'll talk a little bit more and break down what our investment in capital maintenance actually is. And then salaries and benefits is almost $2 million. Of course, a certain amount of our salaries and benefits are going to contribute towards capital renewal. So that would be our direct labor and project management.
Councilmember White.
Thank you. To back up to that and routine maintenance, there's going to be salaries and benefits. I mean, I presume the salaried folks are doing the work, right?
Correct.
So that I'm not quite getting my head around. Okay, we have building maintenance. I mean, that's first of all, it's such a low number for how many? I mean, what do we have? 5 million square feet of building area or whatever we have. Maybe
right,
less than that.
somewhere
Maybe it's 2
around
million.
there,
What is it? Anyway,
I don't recall.
Anyway, some big
exactly.
number like that. So $150,000 is a very low number for that. And there's going to be a bunch of salaries that are going into that. So could you differentiate between, I mean, is the routine maintenance going for materials that are, I mean, that seems to me we have, well, we have materials down in the lower right, so I'm not getting yet.
Yeah, I mean, we really have a couple of things going on. We have our capital program, which is, capital renewal. I mean, part of our labor will be going into that. We'll be responding to service calls. Part of our labor will be going into that. And then part of our labor will be going into special projects that we do as chargebacks. Right. So, and the reason why I illustrated just this capital component, because I want to start focusing on capital now, to tell you what the real capital investment is in the facilities program. Okay, so for fiscal year 17, we're going to be, our base level funding for our capital program is almost $1.3 million. And I'll break down each one of those components for you. We have our facilities capital program that I just talked about, and this pays for our capital construction contracts, for design contracts, and for general and subcontractors to do the work. It also includes a certain amount of materials for the capital projects that our own staff does, things like doors and windows, electrical equipment, lighting, and so forth. This is a slide from our May presentation before council, and just to illustrate where we showed that money in this slide. And so basically, these are our larger capital projects. Usually in the budget document, we have specific projects outlined that we're going to be doing that year. Okay, the next item is project management and trades labor, and that's a little over $600,000. And that's just what I talked about. It's really a component of our salaries and benefits that contributes towards our capital renewal. So we manage all of our projects, and our staff also contributes direct labor to our projects. And then the third item is just incidental investment. That's more in the area if we get grants, if we have energy incentives that contribute to capital renewal, or if we get additional funding from council for specific projects, CIP projects, that would contribute to that. So in total, we have $1,268,000 in capital renewal just as a base budget.
Councilmember Dominguez.
Yes, can I go back 2 slides to the 507,000 number? So is that exclusive of labor costs?
Yes.
So when we get a quote for like LED streetlights retrofit for 25,000, is there somewhere else in the budget where we'll see what the additional cost would be owing to labor?
There isn't anywhere specifically in the budget that it will show a specific cost for our labor for a particular capital project. That's something that we would track in our work order system.
So when we hear numbers for infrastructure, would those also be not including our labor costs? So if we hear 20 million, 80 million, 400 million, is that also exclusive of labor?
Anything that's listed in the facilities capital program is exclusive of labor. It really is just for contracts and design services from outside agencies.
So
Now, with the exception, there is one line item on there that has facilities. Let me back up here. Miscellaneous facilities renewal. So miscellaneous facilities renewal covers kind of like miscellaneous projects that our staff do from a materials and contract standpoint.
Ms. Bjork?
Mr. Chair, I don't think my speaker's working. It is? It's got a red light. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that all of the information that Mr. Dewey is talking about today is separate and additional to all of the facilities maintenance, the capital maintenance and capital needs that we've been talking about over the last several months with this committee. So I just wanted to make that point and clarify it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, those are like for like. Not like for like. All of our capital improvement would include labor. It also includes costs for city staff managing those projects who charge against the capital dollars. So there is a differentiation between the way that we're managing the facilities and the way that we're managing our general capital. So if you have an engineer managing a project, they're charging their management time against the capital project for the management time.
And so going back, there was a building maintenance slide where there was salaries and benefits of 1.9 million, and then it had an arrow out to 660, and then that dropped down to facilities capital. So that confuses it for me more than it helps me. So I'm not sure why we're breaking out salaries in some and then others, just because if we're trying to track some of these things as big picture numbers, it's important for us to know where we're adding in salaries or labor costs. And I understand if we're paying someone, we're saying this outside contractor is going to fix this intersection. We don't care about labor because we're writing them a check for $1 million. But so it's just confused it for me more. So can you go back to the building maintenance expenses slide that had the yellow circle on the top?
Well, if I can start with this slide, this really shows, all I'm trying to do here is show what component our direct labor from salaries and benefits contributes to the overall facilities capital program. So what I'm saying is that the facilities capital program is more than just the $500,000. It also includes the value of direct labor that we contribute in the facilities program. Does that...
No, in fact. And then seeing incidental investment, that sounds like a revenue source, and these other two circles seem like costs. So, and again, this is all a matter of me going through this the first time, and these are all, technical terms of art that don't necessarily have a plain meaning understanding that I think people can follow along the first time. So maybe it's a matter of breaking some of these out more, and maybe I can sit down with you and staff and do a little bit more of that. But the important thing here is the last button there, the total capital renewal of 1.268, and I think you're trying to show us how you reach that number. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the first chunk, just to make sure I understand it, the facilities capital button, that's construction and design, that's internal work. Is that correct?
The facilities capital button, the 500,000 is in our facilities program, that is for contracts that contribute towards major capital projects.
So that's money we're paying vendors outside of the city staff?
Primarily. It includes some material that city staff uses when we contribute our labor towards that too. But basically it's material and contracts to general contractors, subcontractors, and for design services.
Okay. And then the project management and trades labor button?
That would just be a portion of our salaries and benefits that contribute to direct labor to support our capital program.
So is there a difference between labor and salaries and benefit, or can I treat those as the same?
The same.
Okay. And labor, that's always going to be then city labor?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other button that had the salaries and benefits. Can we go back to that slide?
go back to that?
Yeah, what is the 660,524 figure?
It's the amount that is contributed towards direct labor to our capital program. So this is just another way of showing what I showed you on, when I'm calculating the total investment in facilities capital. I just did it, as showing that, okay, out of the $2 million, we expect that about $660,000 of that will contribute to direct labor to our capital investment or into our capital maintenance program.
Salaries and benefits.
Yes.
So, yeah, then no, I'm still not on board because you just said that same button on the next page went to construction and design or contracts and materials.
Okay, what I said was that the facilities capital button, the $500,000, is just for contracts and for contracts for design and materials.
So that has nothing to do with city salaries or benefits?
Yeah, that's why I broke out, the project management and trades labor. That's the salaries and benefits contribution,
Okay.
the value added to the project.
So what is the relationship between the 660? So that would just be the, okay, now I see. This is the same as the button on the next page. And so then what would the balance of the 1.9 be going back to the building maintenance expenses? If that's not salaries and benefits going to facilities capital?
It's what I was explaining to Councilmember White, that labor contributes to other things like responding to service calls, taking care of labor that we use for our chargeback programs.
And so that's about 1.2.
It also includes, administrative labor. So it would include management and admin staff.
And so that's like overhead. It's actually accounted for differently than the other salaries and benefits.
Yeah, when I pulled out all the expenses, I just had salaries and benefits as a one item. So, yes, you can consider some of that as overhead. In this presentation, I did not.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so looking at the total investment in the facilities capital program, we also want to add in other specially funded projects that are funded on an annual basis from our capital improvement program. This year that includes ADA capital of about $100,000 and building walkways and pathways of about $100,000. So our total facilities capital program is about $1.5 million this year. More may be added to it, depending on if we have any special projects that come up or if general funds are available to contribute to more capital maintenance. Okay.
Any other
covers that
questions
section.
at this section? On to the modeling work. Go ahead.
Okay. The Facilities Resource Renewal Model, or FRRM. In this part of the presentation, I'm going to discuss what that is and why we have it, what information it provides, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what capital maintenance is versus major capital renewal. So the FRRM is really software. It's web-based software. It's a database of all of our general fund buildings and all of the building systems within our buildings, things like roofing systems, air conditioning, electrical stuff, everything that needs to be replaced in a building. And what it does for us, it provides a basis for our allocated charges to departments. It estimates when systems need replacement and what their costs are. It determines the annual cost of capital maintenance, what we should be funded in order to completely fund our program and not have any deferred maintenance. And it also calculates the deferred maintenance backlog.
So how fine-grained is this data? You know, we have very old buildings that have unclear histories as to when work was done and the life cycle of the systems in these buildings. Were there surveys done on all the different buildings at different points in time that got you back different quality of data that's plugged into this software?
But before we rolled the software out, we completed a survey of the buildings.
Okay, so all the buildings in the city were relatively recently surveyed, or within the last 10 years? Kind of
Within the last 7 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you feel pretty confident on the quality of that information?
Yes. Yeah, we produced it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilmember Dominguez?
And when it says all general funds, so this is excluding enterprise funds,
Correct.
do they use the same software but do it in-house, or do they use a different system?
I'm not sure what the individual enterprise funds do to model their capital maintenance.
And how would you interface with them on that? Do you have to interface with them on that, or do they do all their own contracting and internal servicing?
Usually our interface is when they call us for special projects to be done, and then we handle that on a chargeback basis.
So then the enterprise funds aren't a big part of the allocated charges,
They are not.
and that's because they do it internally?
Yes, they take care of their own maintenance. The only times that a enterprise fund gets charge allocated charges is when they reside partially in a general fund building, like Public Works.
Okay, thank you.
I guess it is sort of a question that's hanging out there, though, for Mr. Samario, Mr. Casey, about the use of how do the enterprise funds do the same work that you're doing for their own entities? Do they have a level of sophistication, that's on this level, or is it Ms. Bjork? You get the
Mr. Chair,
question.
members of the committee, the enterprise funds manage it somewhat differently depending on the enterprise fund. You will remember that I think it was last week at council, we were there with a contract for a project to do a scope of work at our parking garages. And that was essentially the same kind of assessment to come up with a planned program of work and an understanding of capital need going forward for that facility. So that's an example of how downtown parking does that work. The water and wastewater facilities have detailed capital improvement plans that are based on condition assessments and have an ongoing program of asset management where they have developed pretty complex asset registers for all the assets in their facilities and have an understanding of the life of those assets, a prioritization of replacement, and manage those in that manner. For our water pipes and sewer pipes, we have more of a council level of effort effect where we're planning or trying to keep up with 1% per year replacement. That is more based on a level of effort than a level of need. And so it varies a little bit enterprise to enterprise. I can't speak as much for waterfront and airport, but I know that both of them have developed capital programs as well that manage their facilities on that same basis.
Has there been discussion internally in the city about having a system like this for those are probably the best examples, waterfront and airport, where there are old physical buildings in addition to something like the sewer treatment plant that's a different animal than...
So most of the assets of either water or wastewater are in the non-building portion, and so the capital program is really largely focused at the assets, the non-building assets of the program, and a lot of the time the building assets are associated to the non-building. So we'll have offices at the wastewater plant. The Cater plant is actually built over part of the treatment facilities. We do have what we call computerized maintenance management systems similar to the FRRMM that we use for all of those. Some of the ones you'll hear thrown around are Cartograph. We're currently undergoing a request for information to update the water and wastewater plant CMMS modules, because the one we have is 15 years old now, and we've been getting by with it, but it really doesn't have the functionality we need to keep up anymore. So, but we do have very similar systems. They're designed and dedicated for specialized assets. So they're different. They're not the same as this model, but they would have the same role.
And just so I understand you have a system here that is sounds robust and effective, and the individual departments that are enterprise funds have developed their own systems on their own time frame that are also sophisticated but different. And has there ever been a conversation about integrating those two?
It's interesting. They're so specialized. We have a real need for linkage of our distributed assets, our pipelines, onto our GIS system, and there are asset management programs that are specialized in that. So, for instance, Cartograph is the one we've adopted citywide. So that links to the GIS well. It doesn't do well for vertical assets like plants. So we aren't able to use that asset, that CMMS program, for managing our vertical assets because it's really developed to be linked to a spatial database. So we do look for opportunities to manage, use centralized computerized maintenance management systems because it decreases our resource need, but it's much more important to have the maintenance management system meet the need of the asset you're managing, and they're quite specialized.
I can totally understand that in regard to these high asset, significant infrastructure investments like the sewer treatment plant and things. Less so, I would think, the buildings and the offices and those things. And so that's what I'm sort of getting to. It sounds like Mr. Dewey's system is robust for that kind of an asset. And that's what and it sounds like that wouldn't necessarily be the focus of the asset modeling equipment at the enterprise fund level. And that maybe that's where there's some crossover. And probably specifically, waterfront, airport, lots of buildings, not of the type that you're describing. Is that a fair characterization? What am I missing in that?
I think the only differentiation I would make is that those non-asset portions are such a small part of the infrastructure that's being managed by the enterprises that they're readily, easily managed given the scope of the capital, the infrastructure that needs to be maintained.
The airport, the biggest assets, the
airport I really
the
can't
roads,
speak to, I'm afraid, but
things like that.
They have a significant program of investment, of course, working closely with FAA and FAA grants. And then they have, of course, the brand new terminal, which is nice, but maintenance and management of that, that's one place where we might have some, because that is a very significant facility that is a little different than most of our other utilities.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Dewey.
That's okay. So what does life cycle modeling offer? It answers questions such as how much will a department need annually for renewal? What is the overall size of the city's deferred maintenance? What is the status of air conditioning across all the departments? And how much capital repair is needed in the next 5 years in order not to increase the city's deferred maintenance backlog? And so why we have it. So the Facilities Management Fund provides capital renewal for buildings. So we renew all of those building systems. So this is similar to what Ms. Bjork talked about, to the Cartograph system that's used in streets and water. And so in streets, they produce a CPI, or a PCI, a pavement condition index. In the same way, the FRM produces an FCI, a Facilities Condition Index, that shows the overall health of our buildings. What the FRM doesn't do, it doesn't prioritize deferred maintenance and renewal projects for us. It just provides the model of what needs to be renewed. It doesn't provide project budgets. Every time that we go out to bid, we need to produce our own budget based on whatever the scope of the actual project is. In a nutshell, it doesn't make the management decisions for us. It just shows us what's coming, how much funding we expect to spend in our buildings over time. The when and the where and what projects that we're actually going to do is really a management decision. It doesn't tell us specifically about what we should do. And it doesn't provide a model for the replacement of major structural components, foundations, major renewal, or code upgrades. That would be part of what we would call a major capital renewal that I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is a data entry sheet for the FRM, and this particular building is the Central Library. It accounts for a building type, whether a building is a complex building, a simple building, a basic building. That really depends on how much whether a building is a wet or a dry lab, whether it has special equipment in it. It has the age. We put in the date that the building was built, the gross square footage, and any special consideration. In this case, a special consideration is that this is a library. It's in a historic district, which means that when we go to perform any work in that building, it might be a little more expensive because we have to deal with historic issues. It's a heavily used building, so the age of these building systems may be less than normal. So it accounts for all of that. It takes information based on bids and construction cost data from our area to produce this. It also models all the building systems, roofing systems, building exteriors, carpeting and flooring, etc. It has an estimated system life cycle for each one of those building systems. And from that, it produces a renewal date. And as we renew each one of these systems, we go back into the system and update that. And so the system is really based on, there's a lot of subsystems, and each subsystem has a certain life associated with it. And this is all based on industry standards and our own experience. So plumbing fixtures may be replaced every 25 years. Interior finishes like paint maybe every 15 years. And so one of the reports that we get from this is just a 5-year look ahead at the library building. It shows us how much deferred maintenance backlog we have in each one of the building system areas, and when each one of those building systems are due for replacement. Whether or not we actually replace those at that particular time, is really a management decision, but it tells us what's coming. So in this case, in 2019, we're going to be replacing plumbing fixtures at $190,000 for that particular building. The other thing it does is it gives us a long look ahead at what our expenses are over time. And this is a 50-year look ahead. And so when you take the average of all these cash flows, basically it tells us what our base level funding needs to be in order to stay ahead of deferred maintenance over time. So our base budget really needs to be about $2.4 million. We have a base budget of around, 1.2, 1.3 million right now. So, there's every year there's more renewal that needs to happen that isn't happening. That'll go into the deferred maintenance column. Now, over the last few years, though, we've had very substantial funding. In 2015, we had a total program of about $2.6 million. I was able to replace all the air conditioning systems in the police department with part of that. In 2016, we had about $2 million. And in 2017, this is just our base budget. This is, about $1.3 million. Maybe at mid-year, we could find some capital projects that could be funded with general fund dollars, or we may bring in grant funds or some other way of funding these projects too. So that number is probably going to increase. But overall, as a base budget concept, we really need about $2.4 million per year adjusted annually. Next, we have the little explanation on the Facilities Condition Index. And what that is, our deferred maintenance, our maintenance backlog divided by the current replacement value of those building systems. And so what we try to do is maintain below 10% in order to be in a good condition. And this is our overall FCI for all of our buildings. We're about 11%. You can see that in parks we have a lot of old, smaller buildings that just need a lot of renewal. And recreation needs some renewal in the buildings too. And then the police department, of course, everyone knows that. But overall, we're actually looking, okay. If you look at our buildings are generally in pretty good condition, and they're able to support all the programs that we're working in those buildings.
Thank you. Where do you pull the DM value? Does that come out of the FRRM?
Yes.
Is that shown on this library example?
Yes. It's at the $1.5 million. And that's just the deferred maintenance and building systems.
So where on this slide is that 1.5?
Oh, it's total by building at the very bottom, where there's a column that says backlog.
It's this
I'm looking at the wrong slide, okay. So this, how does it work, this slide you're referring to? Is this part of the FRRM?
Yeah, so this is a 5-year look ahead. So it tells us what kind of renewal that we need in those systems over the next 5 years. And it also shows the total deferred maintenance backlog in that building.
And so that's the bottom left number for what time period would that be?
Through all time. So, I mean, once items have shifted into deferred maintenance, they're basically, it accumulates. I mean, this is all maintenance that should have been done according to the program that has not been done. So, I mean, it's a grouping of some of that maintenance should have been done 10 years ago. Some of it could have been done 2 years ago. Once it goes into the deferred maintenance column, we don't keep track of the age of the deferred maintenance. It's just in the DM category.
So for 2016, will that be updated this fall?
It's being updated right now. So it'll be updated by the time I roll out our allocated costs.
And so does that end up being the 1.5 plus whatever added into the system this year?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, I don't see anything up for renewal in the library, so it would still be 1.5 and then adjusted for inflation.
The question I have.
Okay, thank you.
And just what you just said. So that number does grow by, you do account for inflation, as you talk about. There was a 10-year number you were using in there, and you are not just leaving it at the cost.
Right, yeah. We assume an inflation factor every year. Okay, so far I've been talking about the facility's capital maintenance, and here I want to explain a distinction between capital maintenance and major capital renewal, because they're two different things. Major capital renewal is that a building is assumed to have a certain life associated with it. A wood frame structure could have an assumed life of 50 to 80 years. A concrete structure could have a 100-year life or more. So every building has an assumed life, and then all of the building systems within that building have lives too. You know, we may be replacing the air conditioning equipment 3 times during the life of a building, and maybe replace the carpet 10 times, depending on the life of the building. But our facilities capital maintenance program does not provide for the major renewal of a building. That's really a separate decision. So, you know, when a building is built, the community gets together, they say, hey, these programs need a home. We want to, you know, contribute or authorize, you know, for this building to be built. A building's built and it has an assumed life. At the end of its life, that building either needs to be dismantled, demolished, it needs to be renewed or rebuilt, and that's a separate decision. So looking at the comparison between capital maintenance is what facilities is responsible for versus major capital renewal. Facilities replaces and renews all of the building systems within a building's normal life. So major capital renewal not only will replace all of those systems and bring it back to year 0, but it'll also do things like it'll renew the structure and foundation, something that is really part and parcel of the building itself. and any seismic upgrades that need to happen. It'll address all the code upgrades, fire, ADA, bring the building up to code, and maybe install an elevator, a new modern elevator. And it'll also include any additions or reconfiguration of the buildings that the programs need in order to continue on for another 50, 80, or 100 years. And so that is a different item. So when we talk about, what is the capital need in facilities, there's really two things that we're talking about. We're talking about ongoing funding to replace building systems, but there's also a need out there to renew buildings. And you can't see the years here, but this is a histogram of all of our buildings by gross square footage by year built. And the takeaway from that is this. 60% of our gross square footage is over 60 years old. We have a lot of buildings that need major capital renewal. And I estimate that number to be about $218 million, and that would include the police station that needs to be rebuilt. And like I said, our deferred maintenance backlog is growing because our annual maintenance needs to be increased in order to stay on top of just the facilities capital maintenance program. And of course, when we get into a major capital project, it renews all of those building systems, roofs and exteriors, electrical, plumbing, and mechanical, and also provides structural upgrades, elevator upgrades, code upgrades, brings the building up to modern standards, and then gives it a new life. So it's like a cradle-to-cradle approach. So that is really a separate issue and really requires another level of thought.
Question?
Councilmember White?
So that 218 million, how does that fit into the $400 million number that's bandied about as our overall unfunded liability? Is this part of it? Is it? It is. I'm seeing a nod of heads. That's yes. So that's half of the streets. That was kind of the other big piece, I guess, that we were talking about, the various street infrastructure activities, but not including water pipes and sewer pipes. That's the enterprise fund stuff. And so this does not include also the enterprise fund buildings, the waterfront buildings and the airport buildings.
Correct.
That's in another category. So this is the general fund package.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Dewey? Councilmember Dominguez?
The annual renewal graph, all systems, the green ink. What is there's a couple spikes here, and I have a pretty small version here. What are these spikes indicating?
Your bill, right?
Yeah, are you talking about this graph or the histogram?
Oh, no. I think it was the other one, no?
I would have to look at what's going on 30-something years into the future, but it represents that there's buildings that were probably built around the same time that have a lot of infrastructure that comes up, things like piping and maybe ductwork systems, things like that. I'm just taking a guess here. I mean, I would have to look into that. And, if you'd like, I can sit down with anyone who wants to see it, and we can poke around in the system, and you can see exactly where all this information comes from.
Just for the moment anyway, you could go forward a couple of slides to your histogram, and you see a double spike on that there, which I can't...
I believe it's 1970-something.
1960 is one spike, and
1975
is the other one.
Yeah, so then if you were to match those up to that wiggle on the graph, maybe you're getting somewhere.
So I have one other question, if I...
Go right ahead.
So you mentioned some of the things that the model doesn't do, major structural systems, foundations. So how do we track those? Those are pretty significant expenditures.
Correct. And all of those things are part of, a building's normal life. So in other words, we cannot renew a building's structure or its foundation, that's really considered a major capital renewal. I can provide numbers for that, but that's not really considered a building system from our standpoint. That's really considered an integral part of the building that needs to be considered in a major capital renewal project.
So is that not part of the 218 figure? Or
That is part of the 218 figure, yes.
So how do you account for those? Do you have a separate spreadsheet? Do you have a different modeling software?
It's mostly manual modeling. It's something that I do myself based on square footage renewal numbers.
So the graph we were looking at with the green line, does that include these major renewals?
It does not.
Okay. That might be something that we should take a look at, although if you said the 218 does include those?
Yes. I mean, when we talk about, foundations and structures, like let's say if we looked at the police station, as far as I know, there's nothing wrong with the foundation of the building. The building has some structural issues that can be overcome with some retrofits. Whether or not we really want to do that or whether the police station is big enough is another management decision. But that building could be renewed without having to pour a new foundation, for instance. And so a building renewal may not include, replacing a foundation. I mean, if you have to replace the foundation, that building's going to be demolished and it's going to be rebuilt or not rebuilt.
So then the 218 number, that would include those, and then does that grow at a certain rate per year, or is that just the inflation rate?
Well, I mean, we would inflate it. It really depends on what our knowledge is of the buildings when we decide that, now this building is ready for a major renewal. Just it's based on what we observe and the age of buildings. So there isn't really, I don't have a sophisticated model for that. The only thing that I know is that we have old buildings and a lot of them need to be replaced or have major renewal.
Okay. Yeah, so if you could at some point in the near future get us a list of the stuff that the FRRM does not cover, some of the significant things like foundations or structural repairs, that would be great.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that just the big picture takeaways are, number one, that we're not keeping up with the deferred maintenance backlog. That's a big deal. I know we had a significant conversation about that the previous fiscal year, wanting to make sure we're doing that so that so the deterioration doesn't get worse. And so that is a little surprising, discouraging that we're not keeping up with that as a baseline. And that is a function of just tough budget decisions but we probably should have had a more detailed conversation about doing any additional capital improvements in the context of this. That probably is something to consider every year. I mean, it's a tricky call because either way you're deferring the backlog. But I think ultimately what we're trying to do is develop a system that we can go to the public and say, we've thought ahead, we know what's coming ahead, we know what expenses are ahead, we know that if we're going to ask voters to increase the sales tax or whatever funding mechanism, that it is going to address these issues in a systemic way that is sustainable. That's ultimately the story and the plan that we have to develop. And that's, I think, where these two things are intersecting. So we want to make sure, particularly if we're talking about something that goes ahead for 20 or 30 years, that in addition to addressing the existing backlog, that we are accounting for the backlog that will occur in the future, and that is part of this overall plan. And I think that's what's, different than what previous conversations have been, because the numbers required to address that from the last presentation we had here at the Finance Committee looked to be bigger than previous conversations about that. That what you could get for a 0.5 cent sales tax measure was not sufficient to address that entire story. And that 3/4 probably was not either. And even a cent was tough to pull it off. But we just want to make sure we're trying to be really systematic, going through each one of these things in a fine way to know that there isn't anything else that we're not covering. And so I think this has been really helpful to understand that better. And we may, as this percolates through and integrates into our understanding of this better, we may have more questions about that. But that's probably for another day, unless people have questions now about that. Councilmember White.
Well, thank you. And obviously, we had an analogous conversation about streets where we actually did suck some money out of some feel-good projects and put it into that depressing, large desert of unmet need in the street world. And we could have done some of that with this maintenance. I mean, the maintenance topic has been one that is familiar to me, and then maybe I don't focus on it enough year to year to year to year to say this. I mean, I think we all know that $1.2 million is some of the best bang for the buck that there is out there. You just are going to get more out of your old buildings if you're just babying them along and catching that leak, the roof leak, sooner. So that definitely is an area where I hope that we can return to that. And it's also not sexy. I mean, it's just I think of the ball field conversation we had and how we jiggled around those numbers. What's more important? Is it more important to put $1 million into the maintenance of our existing inventory of structures that are depreciating, or rehabilitating a structure that is fully depreciated and isn't going down further? So it's tough. It's certainly nothing easy about it, and I appreciate your comments about going forward, that we are looking at a funding campaign soon, and that we want to be rational and smart about it to tell a good story. I mean, tell a wise story, I should say. But I do appreciate the conversation today. It's a great education for us and clearly for the whole council too. It does teach us a lot about our wonderful and aged collection of resources.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Chair, committee members, I just wanted to comment. I think that, we do clearly need to have more investment into the maintenance, but I think that we're doing a good job, actually, a much improved job over before Mr. Dewey on maintaining those assets in those buildings. And I think it's important also to remember that the deferred maintenance is a model, and that also we will make decisions to continue to defer maintenance on a facility that is either already run to failure, or where we know that the investment there won't pay off very well because something really significant needs to happen. So those influence these numbers a little bit, and I think it's important to keep it in context of the overall picture, and that comes into what Mr. Dewey was saying about when we make decisions about major capital or major facility renewal, that wouldn't necessarily be captured in that deferred maintenance number. And I also want to point out that Mr. Dewey indicated that between 10 and 15% was a good number, and we're there with some really notable exceptions that I think is where we need to focus. And my guess is that those really notable exceptions aren't ones that will be solved or corrected through additional maintenance. Those are the facilities that really need significant renewal.
The 10 to 15% I didn't understand, Ms. York.
That's the facilities condition index.
Okay.
I mean, roughly, yeah.
Councilmember Dominguez?
Yeah, maybe, Jim, you're doing too good of a job keeping these buildings looking good and running. The question I had, or maybe it's more of a comment, is regarding the energy use of buildings. And I know we're doing some really neat things with setting aside money from the energy savings that we've accrued. So kudos for that. And I know you've talked about, you've mentioned code upgrades on here, and that's something I think we can always keep pushing ahead for. I think that's something that the people of Santa Barbara believe in, is saving some energy, and buildings use some 70% of all the energy in the world. So to the extent we can keep moving our buildings forward up the index and having them be conserve more energy and pretty soon producing energy with solar, I think we'd all be pretty happy with that. I'm not sure how that would play into the FRRM if there's a way to add in a module on that, or if it's just more as you're designing improvements and implementing them, there are things you can add in that will achieve our goals. That's something that we'd love to be kept up to date on. Thank you.
Sure. And so the FRM does not model, energy efficiency, but we do, of course, have a energy conservation program that is always looking at our energy use index for every building, so we know where the opportunities are. And the nice thing about energy is that we can invest in these energy conservation projects like new LED lighting, and that contributes towards the replacement of these building systems and towards resolving some of the deferred maintenance issues too, as well as saves, general fund dollars.
So what is the biggest constraint to moving down that path more aggressively? Is it capital to make those improvements? Is it tariff issues with the PUC? Given that there's this cost-benefit equation,
it's really a matter of available capital for that investment. And this year, for the first year, we're starting off our utility management fund, and we're going to go out. I mean, basically, we'll be realizing savings in that fund that we can reinvest in more energy conservation. And there was some seed money that was given to us for that purpose. That's our beginning capital point. And so next year around this time, I'm going to report back and say how successful we are. We'll be tracking all of our investments and seeing how we're doing. And ideally, we'll be saving more and more money in that we can reinvest. But yeah, investment capital is always the issue.
So in that context, when we last had the spreadsheet that included all the different elements of deferred maintenance that were being considered to be addressed by a future revenue measure, we should look at a spot for that capital investment to do the energy conservation that we're talking about. That should be another cost that we should include in this overall package to understand, because we're not going to be able to do everything, but we ought to at least throw everything into that conversation to understand, where we get the most bang for the buck. And I think that is one of the areas where front-loading that capital investment saves us money down the road and is a smart decision to do.
Sure, and also in a major capital renewal project, a lot of these systems are going to be brought up to the latest Title 24 energy codes. Mm-hmm. So, we'll have the latest and the greatest built into the buildings, but there's a lot of other technologies out there that we could add to the building, maybe a solar project or energy storage, or there's a lot of different technologies that are coming that we could incorporate into a building that we might think about as an investment.
Like even the LED streetlights is probably the best single example of, if you had the capital to do that citywide, that would generate savings from year one that over 10 years would probably eclipse the capital cost. But not having that initial investment is stopping that from happening.
Yes.
Okay. Then that definitely needs to be integrated into this conversation. So that's my sense of it anyway. All right, well, are there any more other questions for Mr. Dewey? Thank you again for all the information. It's very helpful. And we have public comment. So, Bonnie, did you want to add anything? Okay. Anything anybody wanted to add that wasn't on the agenda? Okay. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.